And lastly, it's my pleasure today to introduce our presenter, Bob Apollo. He's founder and chief outcomes officer at LeveragePoint, where he works with B2B CEOs and sales leaders to accelerate revenue growth through the proven principles of outcome-centric selling. So with that, Bob, welcome.
Well, Nick, thank you very much. And I'm really pleased to be here. So our subject today is why B2B sales organizations should find it valuable to understand and to focus on customer outcomes. Well, I believe that. So let me try and share with you some of the reasons why I think a focus on outcomes is the thing that can help B2B salespeople achieve greater success. And of course, it's intimately tied with the whole value story anyway. So I want to start by illustrating what may be familiar to a number of you, a conventional B2B sales process. It's a process that goes from stage to stage, often labeled things like discovering, qualifying, and so on. So I want to ask you the question, what's wrong with this picture? Well, let me tell you what I think is wrong with this picture. Firstly, whenever we call something a sales process, it's almost inevitable that we end up describing phases that are based on sales actions and not on customer behaviors. The whole model, the visualization, assumes a linear, a one-way, and no going back sales process. In fact, in the olden days, for example, Sandler Selling used to describe the process as being a submarine where you slammed a watertight door behind you as you move forward. And, you know, there's also the assumption, isn't there, that if we only think of this as a sales process, that process is over once an order's been booked. Well, let me see if we can't confront reality. And this diagram, something some of you may be familiar with, is taken from some groundbreaking work that Gartner have been doing in the last couple of years to understand the reality of B2B buying. And it's been accurately described by a number of people as like life in the spaghetti bowl. It's not linear. At any point, the buying process can be interrupted, sidetracked. It can go backwards as well as forwards. And of course, it can be abandoned at any point. So I think this, rather than the diagram we saw earlier, much better reflects the reality of what our B2B customers are going through. But you know, even this isn't really enough to describe what a B2B buyer or a buying organization goes through. Because the truth of the matter is, their buying journey doesn't just start when our conventional sales process might start. It goes all the way back to their current situation and a trigger event, something that caused them to become concerned about a business issue that they wanted to find out more about. And of course, it doesn't finish at the point the order's taken, because if I'm a buyer, if I'm trying to solve a business problem, my buying journey is only over when I actually achieve the better outcome that I've been looking for. So the actual buying decision, or we can perhaps call it the problem-solving journey, stretches far further than most conventional definitions of a sales cycle. And I think it's got to be apparent that we've got to take this into account if we're to try and make sure that we do the things that will help our prospective buyers be confident in a decision to buy. There are, you see, I think some serious consequences. One, prospects are having to process overwhelming amounts of information. This is one of the reasons why the sort of spaghetti bowl circles around. That without internal consensus, a decision to change is unlikely. And again, the work done by Gartner and by others suggests that in a typical complex buying decision, we might have between 6 to 10 actively involved stakeholders, sometimes more. And if they can't all align, it's likely that the project won't go ahead. It's also true in this complex world that a lack of decision confidence is probably now the most common barrier to moving forward, to making progress. And as a result, and maybe you've seen this in your own environment, an increasing number of apparently promising opportunities, an increasing number of buying journeys are being abandoned. So what can we do about it? Well, I think one of the things we need to do is to understand that our approach to B2B selling has evolved and it needs to continue to evolve. Now, in the old days, it was probably typical that B2B sales organizations took a product-centric approach. They sought to understand the customer's requirements. Their discovery process revolved around capturing already recognized needs. Very often they tried to position their value as being associated with features, advantages, and benefits. And this really represents what I characterize as a traditional B2B sales organization mindset. But the world has moved on, and it's probably accurate to say that most of today's B2B sales organizations would call themselves solution-centric rather than product-centric. And that the guiding principles there are around understanding and solving our customers' problems. So instead of trying to ask the customer what their needs are, our discovery might then be focused on uncovering pain. The value is based often on a projected return on investment in what we call our solution. So this is really, today's common solution selling process, and it's probably typical of current complex B2B sales mindsets. But I want to suggest to you that there's a further evolution that's underway already, and that's around outcomes. And it's around understanding that end point of the customer buying decision journey, maybe influencing it, and focusing on achieving the customer's expected outcomes. So when we think about discovery, then it's not just about needs, it's not just about pain, but discovery is also about shaping the customer's expected outcomes. Our value is created by achieving those expected outcomes. And this model, I think, is particularly critical in any as-a-service business that's based on customer renewal. Because rather than a sales process, what we really have, I think, if we're seeking to drive usage and renewal rates, is a customer success process. And given that the TSIA has shown a dramatic shift away from selling things which were packaged as products to things which are delivered as subscription services, and that trend continues unabated, I think this has to be the future of complex B2B sales. And I want to put it to you that if you can take an outcome-centric sales approach, you're going to dramatically increase the probabilities of persuading your customer to change, to take action, to choose you, and of achieving the lasting customer success that we're all looking for. So how do we try and achieve that? Well, for the rest of this webinar, I want to concentrate on 4 questions, 3 gaps, and a bridge. Now, you're probably wondering what on earth I mean by that. So let me try and explain. I believe, particularly in complex buying journeys, your customer has 4 key questions that they need to answer before they can come to a conclusion. And the first one is, so what is it about our current situation that's unsatisfactory? In other words, why do we need to change? rather than stay on our current path. And of course, if sticking with the status quo is the most common outcome, and it is, this becomes an absolutely critical question for us to influence and to answer. Our customer might then think, well, if we do have to change, which option should we implement? In other words, why should they choose you rather than any other option? 3, why is action urgent? This is really about why they need to act now rather than later. Again, if they don't outright reject your proposal, it might be that they say, we'd love to do business with you, but we're going to do it later because something of a higher priority is on our radar right now. And then the last element, and in an environment where so many stakeholders are involved, in an environment where consensus is a key part of making decisions, the 4th question is, who's going to benefit and how? In other words, why should we support this project rather than other priorities? Because it's not unusual, I find, for maybe your competition at the start of the sales process is other vendors that look like you. But very often, particularly if it's a discretionary purchase rather than an inevitable one, your most powerful competitor at the end of this cycle is not another vendor that looks like you. It's your customer deciding to pursue a different priority, a different project. So I spoke about 3 gaps. So the first gap is what I'll call the outcome gap. And this is again about contrast. It's about sticking with the status quo or changing direction to achieve a better outcome. Now, if your customer, if your prospective customer sees this gap, the difference between their current situation and what they might achieve in the future as being insignificant, goes without saying, they're likely to remain on their current path. So what we need to do is to maximize that outcome gap, because whenever that gap, that outcome gap, is clearly significant or growing, our prospective customer is far more likely to commit to urgent action. So how might we influence them? Well, firstly, we need to find ways of helping them to recognize that staying on their current path is more dangerous, it carries more risk, it's more likely to result in an unsatisfactory outcome than maybe they currently realize or have admitted to themselves. And contrasting that by convincing them that the benefits of change, the upsides, are more significant than maybe they currently realize. And this can be a matter of introducing previously unrecognized issues or consequences and helping our customers to acknowledge them and their impact. Now, that's all very well. Maybe we've helped to persuade them that action is necessary, that action's a priority. Then we need to turn our attention to answering their why you question. And for me, this is about the solution gap. It's about creating contrast between all their other solution options and your distinctively different approach. And I use the word approach very deliberately. This is not a matter of having a longer feature set than your competition. What becomes really powerful is if your customer believes that you're actually going to take a distinctively different approach to solving their problem, and one that's much more likely to result in the outcomes that they're looking for. So once again, if this solution gap is insignificant, they're likely, if they do something, to choose the cheapest or the most familiar option. Or maybe they'll stick with the status quo. So when it comes to this solution gap, it should be obvious to us that the wider the perception of the solution gap between our approach and all of their other options, the more likely they are to choose us and to pay a premium price for our solution. So how do we do this? And without knocking the competition, we need to help them to recognize that all of their options offer inadequate or incomplete or risky solution approaches. Whereas we want them to buy into, to understand why we've taken the approach we have, and to explain to them how and why that approach is different and how it's going to lead to better business outcomes for them. That's how we can maximize their solution gap. Now, the third gap, I'm going to call the fear of missing out gap. And that's the contrast between the cost and risk of inaction and the benefits of positive change. Looks like we've got a battery challenge going on, but I'll try and avoid it affecting me.
All set. Sorry about that.
So, and again, if you followed the line of argument for the previous two gaps, when their fear of missing out is low, they'll be inclined to think they can afford to delay their decision. So our role, again, is to maximize the fear of missing out gap, because at a number of levels within the organization, the fear of missing out can provide really powerful motivation to take action sooner rather than later. And that's particularly true if we help them to recognize that both the cost of delay and the benefits of action are only going to grow over time. So again, in our narrative, in our conversation, in our value story with our prospective customer, we need to find ways of persuading them that the longer they stay on the current path, the worse things will get. And to persuade our prospective customer that the sooner they start to make changes, the greater the benefits. So we've had three gaps. And now we turn our attention to creating a bridge. And this, for me, is about establishing a consensus for change around all of the stakeholders, around why change, why you, and why they need to act now. And in today's consensus-driven world, if the answers to any of these three questions are weak, the stakeholders will struggle to agree on a course of action. If the benefits to the organization as a whole are unclear or insignificant, the project's unlikely to be approved. And if any of the benefit messages to any of the key functions represented by the stakeholder group are unclear, they're going to be lukewarm in their support for the project. So here, what we need to do is to illustrate how our unique approach is going to help them achieve the positive change they're all looking for. We need to understand how what we're proposing is supportive of the executive team's priorities, that they understand how we help, and that we can offer them some additional benefits. And if it's line of business that's driving the project, equally, we need to articulate how we address their top priorities, how particularly we help, and maybe what additional benefits we offer them. And this applies in any technology-related decision, of course, to understanding IT's priorities, to understanding finances, priorities, and maybe there are some other beneficiaries as well. And my acid test for this is that we're able, in the executive summary of our proposal, is to have a series of short statements along the lines of what this means for either the organization as a whole, the function, or a particular stakeholder is a targeted, relevant benefit. That's how we tell a compelling story. So, three gaps in a bridge. Why change? Persuading our customer they can't afford to stick with the status quo. Why us? Convincing our prospect that our approach is the one that's most likely to succeed. Why now? Convincing our prospect they need to act now rather than later. And who benefits? Making sure that everybody who's got a significant role to play in the decision sees clear benefit from the project. So if you think about it, These first three considerations are questions of contrast. We are most effective when we contrast why change, why you, and why now. What they could accomplish, what would happen if they don't. But the who benefits question is one of achieving consensus. So, three gaps and a bridge. Contrast leading to consensus. Now, the way we can do this is by telling a unique value story. And let me quickly summarize how we can accomplish this. So if you think about our four key questions, why change, there are a number of things, and I'll illustrate this in a moment, that we need to help them come to terms with. When it comes to why us, we need to help them understand, or we need to understand what their options are. We need to articulate what sets us apart and what unique advantages they offer. We need to pull a business case that not only justifies the investment, but highlights the cost and the consequences of delay. And then, of course, we need to make sure that we've positioned our value proposition in terms that are relevant to every member of the stakeholder group. So let's think about that first question. Why change? Why do they need to change rather than staying on their current path? And I think the first thing we want to understand here is what's their current situation. And the current situation has got to include one or a number of issues that, with our help, hopefully, they come to recognize they need to either fix, avoid, or achieve. But simply understanding what they need or what they want isn't sufficiently powerful, because we need to reinforce the danger of staying on their current path by helping them to acknowledge the negative consequences of sticking with the status quo. That might be increased risk, increased cost, reduced revenue potential. And now, having established their current situation, we now need to help them visualize the better business outcomes they could achieve, but also to recognize what might have to change in order to achieve it. And of course, balancing the cost of inaction, the negative consequences of staying where they are, help them to really buy into and appreciate and believe the positive consequences of implementing the necessary changes. So you can see how this is really an issue of contrast between their current situation and their better future outcomes. But you know, there's a couple of other things that is very useful for us to learn when we craft this story. And the first one is, so how does this project relate to their key corporate initiatives, programs, and priorities? I think it's pretty well established that even if our project doesn't have a one-to-one relationship with these initiatives, programs, and priorities, if it can be seen to be a supporting pillar to something the CEO talks about, something the executive staff are obsessed about, the chances that the project's going to go ahead are that much stronger. And then I think we also, if we're trying to create a well-rounded value story, need to help them understand, maybe draw their attention to the obstacles that could prevent them from achieving those business outcomes. So in answering why change, this outcome gap needs to be as wide as possible. And of course, all of this needs to be verified in our discussions with our prospective customer. Now let's think, we've laid a foundation now, we have persuaded them and will continue to persuade them of the value of change. Now, we need to persuade them of the value of choosing us rather than any other option. And in order to do that, we obviously need to understand what other options they're actively considering. And in many cases, those options might not be restricted simply to the vendors you regard as your classic competition. They could be any other credible approach to address the issues that you identified in the why change story. And having understood what other options they're considering, we need to establish and get them to believe and buy into the key differences between our approach and all of those other options, and how that leads to unique business advantages. So if you're going to win their business, it's my belief that the solution gap needs to be as wide as possible. Now, they've recognized the need for change. They recognize that you offer a superior approach, but what about the third question? Why do they need to act now rather than later? Now, I think it's obvious for any of you who've bought into the concept of value creation and value articulation, and that's, I'm sure, why you're on this webinar, that you need a solid business case. You need to be able to contrast a credible return on investment with the costs and consequences of inaction. But on top of that, and maybe this is more to do with evidence, with customer stories, with third-party validation, how they can be confident both about the need to act and in their choice of your company and your solution. And then third, because without this question being answered, they will probably put things off. Why is it that they need to take decisive action now rather than waiting until a later date? So I think the important lesson here is, even if our prospective customer has decided to change, even if they prefer you, we'll often need to convince them. They need to act now rather than later. And that's in part where Who Benefits comes in, about ensuring the support of key stakeholders, not just the exec team, but also line of business, IT, finance, and any of the other beneficiaries. And our goal in establishing this part of the story has got to be to make sure that what we have to offer resonates with these communities, and that we have established the widest possible base of support for that approach. So I want to suggest to you that this is linear, just as the buying process isn't linear. This is very often an iterative approach. We'll start to understand some elements of why change, perhaps position why us, start to make a case for why now, develop the who's going to benefit messages, but it's likely we'll have to keep returning and refining in order to turn this into the strongest possible value story. And one of the ways that you could accomplish this, and I want to offer this as a resource to you, is I've worked with clients who are also very focused and very concerned about creating customer-specific value stories. And I've distilled this into a one-page Word template that includes some direct guidelines. And if any of what we've been focusing on in the last few minutes resonates with you, please drop me a line at bob@inflection-point.com, and I'd be happy to share the guidelines with you and hope that you might find them useful in your own organization. Now, I want to make a connection, a really important connection, and that is the connection between a value story and the executive summary of the proposal that you will end up making to your prospective customer. And I believe that exec summary is the most critical element of every sales proposal, notwithstanding all of the delicious detail you've got in your detailed submissions. It's the exec summary that's most likely to be read by the people who are most likely to be responsible for the decision, by the decision makers and the final approvers, and some of them, maybe a number of them, have not previously been involved or maybe unfamiliar with the details of the project. And these decision makers are going to be inclined to question not just, are you the right vendor, but whether the project needs to go ahead now rather than later, or even at all. And unfortunately, my observation, and I've looked at a few of these over the years, is that the majority of sales proposals and their associated executive summaries almost act as if they assume the customer simply has to make a decision between various options, and that the customer hasn't got at the back of their mind, why should they do anything? And whenever a sales proposal focuses largely on promoting why you, it's going to be far less effective as a consequence than one that can succinctly summarize and incorporate all of the four elements of that customer's unique value story: why they should change, why they should choose you, why they should act now, and who will benefit. And if you can incorporate that into your exec summaries, you dramatically improve your proposal's chances of being accepted. And so one of the ways you can think about this value story framework is you're almost working backwards from what you need to know in order to create the strongest possible exec summary. And if you do follow the framework, or a variation of it that works in your environment, it's going to allow you to better qualify the opportunity, to progressively build towards that winning sales proposal right back from the very first conversation you have with a prospective customer. Now, I want to leave you with a final thought, because I do believe, and I hope I've gone some way to persuading you, that taking an outcome-centric approach is highly beneficial to sales organizations, but I don't think you can think of it as a sales-only initiative, because I think exec leadership needs to ensure that their entire organization is explicitly aligned around understanding and achieving their customers' expected business outcomes and actually exceeding the customer's expectations. It means that the development team have got to be focused not just on adding new functionality, but on developing products and services that make it easy for customers to achieve their expected business outcomes and with rapid time to value. For marketing, outcome-centric thinking involves understanding the business issues your customers are trying to fix, avoid, and achieve, and to position your organization as trusted experts. Of course, sales have a pivotal role to play, and that's about understanding the very specific business outcomes, often different, that each prospective customer is seeking to achieve, and giving them the confidence to embark on the change journey with you. And if sales do that well, they lay the foundation for customer success, delivering the hoped for outcomes. And they, of course, need to understand the business outcomes that led your customer to choose to do business with you in the first place, and to make sure they're achieved and recognized. Your support organization needs to be focused around supporting the customer in their journey to achieve those expected business outcomes with a minimum of disruption or fuss. And obviously the rest of the organization, finance, order processing, whoever, if they can focus on making it easy for customers to do business with us for the first time and to want to continue business with your organization, that's how you build a truly outcome-centric culture. So I hope those thoughts have resonated with you and that they'll prove to be applicable to what you're trying to achieve, to the outcomes you're trying to achieve within your business, and the outcomes that you're seeking to help your customer to achieve. I've been pleased to take part in this webinar. I do hope that you found this section has resonated, and if you want to hear more, there are a couple of ways that you can see here of reaching out to me, and I'd be very delighted to hear from you. And now I think it's back to the folks at LeveragePoint.
Thank you, Bob, for sharing your insights. That was a great presentation. So just one added note, if you are interested in reaching out to Bob, you can also indicate in the exit survey in the webinar, and we will forward that along to him after that comes in. So we had a few questions come in during the session, and there's still time to do so. A quick reminder, if you enter a question, you will be entered into the raffle to win a copy of Dollarizing Differentiation Value. But to give you a couple more minutes to enter your questions, it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Hannon, who is VP of Sales here at LeveragePoint. And he's going to talk through, share how our cloud platform can help support sales teams better convey the quantified impact of change, as you just saw, through interactive value stories. So Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you right now.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And I'll show my screen. So hopefully you can see the LeveragePoint website.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So thanks, Bob. Your concepts in that presentation is music to my ears because it's what I talk about all day long. So we very much are aligned in our thinking. I'm going to take a few minutes and show everyone a LeveragePoint value story. And I think especially the gaps that you talk about are really what we try to address when we're creating value stories with our customers and when we're coaching the salespeople on how to present and why they should be using these value stories, in their sales process. So what we're looking at here is an example of a value story. This is a fictitious company called Dean Chemicals, and they actually make a coating, an automotive coating, so essentially paint for car. And what you see here is a very simple value story. What we do when we create them is we use our customer's logo and we use their color scheme. So the presentation looks very similar to what your salespeople would be giving in terms of their PowerPoint presentation. So it's comfortable for them to be giving it, but it really has a different goal and it has a different sort of track. So we think of a value story used in different parts of the sales cycle, but ideally you can use the same value story to accomplish that. You might just be focusing on different parts of it. And this particular value story will start to jump into not what this coating is and what the chemical components are and what necessarily the features are. It starts to focus on what the business impacts of this coating can have on a customer's business, in this case, the automotive manufacturer. And you'll see across the bottom are a series of tabs. You can think of each of those as a PowerPoint slide. But what we try to do, and as Bob mentioned, was to focus on what the solution can do and really highlight, as he calls it, the solution gap. So we start to do that by introducing what we call a case study. So we talk about, to a new prospect, we talk about how we've helped other companies in their industry improve their business with our solution. And in building up the areas of value, which you see on the left-hand side here, these become the solution gap in effect. The gap, in fact, is quantified, and we start to talk about that quantification in the upcoming slides. But here we might be talking today with BMW. And we're going to go over the case study, but we're going to offer to alter the case study so that it better reflects BMW's situation. So as we're describing to them what we've done for other customers, they might tell us, well, we're much larger. We manufacture 100,000 vehicles per year, and we actually use more coating currently today in leaders. So as we make these changes, you'll notice that the numbers start to change. And in fact, the areas of business impact or value on a per vehicle basis will update automatically as well. And we find that this becomes important because as you start to get engagement with the prospect, they start to take ownership of the value story itself. And in fact, once they've begun to take ownership of that value story starts to become more of a business case to buy than a case study. So think of it transforming in the matter of a 15 or 20-minute conversation from a standard case study into BMW's business case for why they should make a change. And hopefully, if we do our job right, we've built up that desire and that need to make a change. And I think, as Bob calls it, the fear of missing out. When the person who you're speaking with starts to take ownership of this story, that fear of missing out increases because now this is their business case, not just a business case that you're pushing on them. So what we typically do with a case study, we'll introduce it and provide kind of an overview up front, make some changes based on feedback, but then we'll go into each individual value driver and we'll talk about how we calculated the value, where we came up with it, basically getting across our logic, and then showing the underlying math here. Now, again, these data points can be changed, based on the feedback that we're getting from the prospect. And if they feel we're being too aggressive in some of our claims, then we can change those. We can also, using the tabs, we can point to, where we came up with that information. So we can point to external sources that say, yes, this claim is valid because of X, Y, and Z. We could even have videos here if we choose to. So once we go through all three of our value drivers and we make any changes based on their feedback, then we would have an overall summary of the cost of the competitive solution, the cost of what we're offering, which is actually more expensive in this case, the value or the additional value that we bring, maybe any incremental costs that BMW would incur to move to our solution, which might be retraining, it might be additional equipment, and then the overall value that they would receive. So this is a very simple executive summary almost, if you will. I would call this whole value story an executive summary. But this is intended to be able to be shared with someone who may not need to understand the chemical aspects of the coating or the specific characteristics, but they do want to understand how that is going to impact their business. And if they want to know across the course of a year, that could save BMW almost $1 million. Now, hopefully that creates enough of a gap that the customer who we're speaking with gets excited and says, hey, I have a chance to save my organization a significant amount of money, move them to a better coating, and everyone wins. And yeah, we might be paying a little bit more up front, but look at all the additional costs that we'll be saving. A couple other points Bob made was, based on who you're speaking with, there may be different aspects of your solution that you want to highlight, or a different conversation that you might want to have. And so we have ways of showing different views of the same story to different people in the organization, again, based on their role and their potential interest. We can also save this, of course, as our BMW value story. And we can go ahead and print it out. Oops, I'll download it to a PDF or a PowerPoint. So now we can hand this off to our prospect. We can also link this into something like salesforce.com and tie it directly into their opportunities so that they have a way when they're doing funnel reviews or they're going back and looking at different deals in history, they can look at the value story that was attached there. So again, very quick summary. Loved what Bob had to say, and I think the value stories can be lined up very well with his approach. and I think they're kind of along the same direction anyway. So any tweaks that need to be made, we work with our customers to do that, to align with their methodologies. And we're happy to have that conversation with any of you. And please contact Bob as well. And I think we're all on the same page here, so it's all good. So I will pass this back to you, Nick.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for sharing that. And if you are interested in a demo of LeveragePoint in your specific use case, you can indicate so in the post-webinar survey. So just tick off the box and request a demo, and we will be in touch with you. So, some questions coming in. The first one, we get this every time. Yes, we're recording the webinar right now, and within 2 business days, you should see both the recording link as well as the slide deck. So Bob, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So first question, it's about across different industries, actually. So do you find different levels of maturity of outcome-centric strategies across different industries? You know, some industries being more mature than others?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So yes, I think there is clear differentiation across industries, but also within industries that, you know, some organizations have gotten on to the concept of focusing on outcomes ahead of their competitors. And I like to think that's bringing competitive advantage. But, you know, I think one of the things you'd look for in saying, is this or that industry, you know, ahead of the curve in adopting an outcome-centric approach? I think any industry and any organization that is embracing selling what they do as a service rather than as an outright sale has tended to almost have to, whether they call it outcome-centric or what have you, understand the real importance of, you know, what the customer's accomplishing, what they're achieving, what their renewal drivers are. So I think that's one thing, you know, industries that are moving towards a subscription rather than an outright sale model are probably at the front of the curve here.
Makes sense, and that's actually something we see with a lot of our customers as they, you know, make a shift in an increasingly service-side economy. So next one I've got is referring back to the 4 key questions. Do you find salespeople struggling with any particular one of these 4 key questions in particular?
Well, so I think many salespeople feel pretty confident about the sort of the why you questioning. Yeah. What I have observed though is they very often might be inclined to rush from the customer expressing a need to pitching their solution and delivering the why us story and the related questions that might fuel that. And my observation is they do better when they resist that itch to pitch, and actually they, in a very disciplined way, stick with the problem, ask those questions, the why change questions, which allow them to determine and shape just how likely it is that the customer is going to do anything. Now, I'll make this observation that is particularly important if the customer is in a discretionary rather than an inevitable purchase. If it's an inevitable purchase, you know, the why change narrative is maybe a little bit less important. But if there's any chance that, you know, this project might get bounced by another investment, if there's any chance that the customer might just stick with what they've got, then the salesperson becoming really confident with sticking with why change and building that narrative is so important.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I've got another one that's somewhat similar to that. So in terms of value stories, I'm sure you work with a lot of clients that claim to going into the engagement, you engaging with them to already do value stories, but I'm sure there's elements of those value stories that are clearly missing according to your definition. So what pieces do you find most commonly missing when companies are trying to go and create their own value stories?
I think one of the areas that's either missing or weak, if it isn't focused on properly, is the cost and consequences of inaction. again, sometimes you see value stories that are really focused on the upside, and why choose us, and you can achieve, better future outcomes, and don't always pay enough attention to what would happen if the customer did nothing. So I think the cost and consequences of inaction are sometimes underplayed and under-recognized, even in organizations that are otherwise doing a fairly decent job of sort of presenting the value of change. It's the sort of cost of continuity versus the value of change.
It's funny you do mention that, because one of the more common ways we work with our clients is actually to help them quantify their solution against the do nothing alternative. And and having that as a reference alternative is, we view that as a very important starting point. So I've got one last one in the queue. It's about technology. So how have you seen really organizations that really do well sharing impactful value stories? How do you see them using technology to kind of make that happen? And do you have any general recommendations in that regard?
Yeah, well, and we've seen an example, haven't we, in the demo of a very good application of technology to support and create value stories. But if we think about the narrative side of this, as opposed to perhaps the economic value story, then any reasonable sharing, collaboration platform that allows salespeople to share their stories that they've created for other customers, to sort them by industry, by type of problem, and so on. So you're not really starting necessarily with a clean sheet of paper, nor are you just starting with the value stories that you personally are familiar with. So, I think a good collaboration platform, and there are many out there, is also a very, very important way of helping salespeople to understand and share those stories.
That's exactly right. Even from an internal basis, having a way of capturing those stories, even across your sales team, is really critical in refining value stories going forward, we find here at LeveragePoint. So I think that's, so those are the questions that I have. So thank you, Bob, for appearing today. And before you go, let's go jump ahead a slide. We have a good webinar coming up next month. So it's going to Timothy Matanovich from Value and Pricing Secrets is going to be joining us, and he's going to be talking about outcome-based, a bit more on the pricing side, and ways to align B2B buyers and sellers on both shared risk and also value delivered. So we're really excited about that one. That's going to be towards the end of September. So again, the survey, you can pre-register, and we'll just send you along the details right in your inbox. So that is all for us today. I want to thank Bob for joining us and sharing his insights. And from everyone here at LeveragePoint, have a wonderful rest of your summer. Take care.
Thank you.